Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a webinar on low acid and acidified foods presented by independent consultant for EAS Consulting Group, Dr. Omar Oyarzabal, and Certified Laboratories, Niharika Mishra. EAS Consulting Group is a member of the certified family of companies and is a global leader in regulatory solutions for industries regulated by FDA, USDA, and other federal and state agencies. Our network of over 150 independent advisors and consultants enables EAS to provide comprehensive consulting, training, and auditing services, ensuring proactive regulatory compliance. And together, EAS and Certified Laboratories offer unparalleled comprehensive service for companies seeking testing and assurances of food safety best practices. Our presenters today are Dr. Niharika Mishra, and Niharika is a process authority at Certified Laboratories and a technical consultant. She is a former commissioner, fellow at FDA. And Omar, if you want to skip to slide number 2. There we go. A former commissioner and fellow at FDA. And she has 14 years experience in thermal and non-thermal food processing and research. Our second presenter is Dr. Omar Oyarzabal, and he is an EAS expert in food safety, independent consultant. He is a lead HACCP instructor, and in 2018, those of you who've been with EAS for a few years, you might remember that he and an FDA representative, Priya Rantham, presented a webinar on unraveling how FSMA impacts acidified food regulations, and you'll find that on the EAS website. So today our presentation will include some representative samples of submitted questions that you may or may not have added when you registered. Additionally, you'll be able to submit additional questions during the webinar. You may do that by typing them into the Q&A box. We'll begin with a brief introduction of low acid and acidified food regulations. We'll include some responses to questions along the way as part of the presentation. And then we'll move on to a review of acidified foods, inspection observations reported by FDA, and then final thoughts, final questions. So with that, I will say thank you so much for joining us. I will turn the presentation first over to Dr. Omar Oyarzabal.
Thank you very much, Amy. Can you hear me?
Yep, sound great.
Great. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be working again with you, Amy, and it's a pleasure to work with Niharika. Basically, the way we organize this webinar is to try to provide something that is a little bit of a complement of the webinar that Amy mentioned that we organized a couple of years ago. So I will probably emphasize quite a bit of some of the basic regulatory components. And if you see in this screen, I'm showing the 21 CFR 108 with the emergency permit control that, gives us some of the guidelines on what are the, components that you have to have when you start manufacturing a low acid canned food or an acidified food. And we will cover a little bit some of the aspect of the other two regulations, 113 and Niharika will talk about 114, with the caveat that, remember, these are complex regulations that have been around for many years. The thermal processing of low acid canned food in hermetically sealed containers comes from the 1970s. And so we're talking about regulations that, have been around for quite a bit of time, okay? So within Part 108, the emergency permit control, I would like to remind everybody that, there is a web page that the FDA has where these establishments that are, intending to manufacture low acid canned foods or acidified foods, they should go there and start the process of registration. The website is very comprehensive now. In the last few years, they have been updating it quite well. There is quite a bit of guidance documents for the industry on, how to proceed, how to fill up some forms. There are even some videos that they have been posting that guide you on how to do that. there are several documents that bring some interpretation on how to do the regulatory components. And we received many, many questions. Some of them we're not going to be able to entertain because they're kind of not part of what we are focusing here, or they're not very relevant. But we received some few questions about the, the SID numbers, FCE numbers. You can read in here, why are we asked about SID numbers when previously it was not required? What products require SIDs and FCEs? Well, those numbers were always required. And if you are manufacturing an acidified food or a low acid canned food, you will have to do that. And let me walk you through the basic of these regulations. A commercial processor that is going to be manufacturing, processing, or packing acidified food or low acid food shall register the facility within 10 days of first engaging in this manufacturing, processing, or packing activities, okay? And basically, the agency, FDA, is expecting from these manufacturers to submit the name of the establishment, the physical address, the location, the processing methods, and the list of foods that will be manufactured. FDA will assign a food canning establishment, that is the FCE number that we're talking about. That will be specific for that specific, plant in a physical location. And then, the establishment is going to be sending information under what is called the form FDA 2541. Most of these are done electronically. That is for each process where they disclose the, the processing schedule, the scheduled processing, okay? So this is the form that I'm talking about. If you see here to the upper corner, that's where FDA will eventually establish a number, okay? Once you have the number, the establishment will have up to 60 days after registration to provide FDA with information on the scheduled process. And you will hear Niharika and I talk about the scheduled processes and processing authorities quite a bit today, because those are important terms regarding this regulation, because remember, we're talking about a high risk foods in which we are making sure that people that are trained understand the formulation and the process to provide the scheduled process that the agencies would like to see. By the way, I'm not mentioning here similar type of regulation that are under FDA that came in the 1980s. I'm just focusing primarily on FDA. But again, there are, I would say, similar type of regulations under FDA, USDA, the Food Safety and Inspection Service, for those commodities that are under that jurisdiction. So the submission identifier is, where you create that when you are filling out the form 2541, and usually have the way of, you add a year, a month, and a date, and there is a unique sequence of numbers that are going to be created if you do it electronically. If you're doing it by paper, you're going to have to create that. This is the form I'm showing here, the filing for acidified food, that is a 2541E. There you have, that's where you have the FCE number that you add to the left, and then you start adding the submission identifier. That number that is created after the year, month, and date is for those cases where people are sitting down in the computer. Most of us do this electronically, and they're sending several, filing the same day. So each filing will have a unique number. Now, let me show you in this slide. It's the same if you're trying to do this filing for, let's say, a low acid food or an aseptic, processing. Here you have also the place where you add the FCE and the submission identifier. So to summarize a little bit, there is the food canning registration, and then you file according to whether you're filing for a retorted method, an acidified method, formulation, water activity and formulation control, or if you're filing for an acidified, low acid aseptic systems. Again, most of these filing are done now electronically. They have been done electronically for many years. In some cases, for instance, when COVID-19 started, I heard of a couple of places where they just went back to doing some paper filing for the first few weeks until they reorganized their schedules. When it comes to the part 113, I'm just gonna touch some very basic definition in here. And the basic definition is the definition of what is a low acid food. That means any food other than alcoholic beverages with a finished equilibrium pH greater than 4.6 and a water activity greater than 0.85. When these regulations were put in place, at that time, they already exempted the tomatoes and tomatoes products. Although they knew they were about 4.6, 4.7, they were exempt from this regulation because of this, historical safety of those products. Another term that is important to remember is the term commercial sterility. This is probably the only time in the food industry when we are using the term sterile, referring to the food products, right? But it's commercial sterility. That means the food, we achieve that commercial sterility by providing conditions. And those are the application of heat, which will render the food free of microorganisms capable of reproducing in the food under normal, non-refrigerating condition of storage and distribution, and viable microorganisms, including spores of public health significance, or by the control of the water activity and the application of heat, which render the food free of microorganisms capable of reproducing in the food under normal, non-refrigerating condition of storage and distribution. We emphasize here the fact that when we are talking about low acid canned food and acidified food, these foods are under, if they are under this regulation, it's because the manufacturer wants to sell them as shelf-stable food, okay? If you are using refrigeration throughout, the storage, you are excluded from these particular, regulations. Another definition is the schedule process, which means the process selected by the processors as adequate for a given product to achieve commercial sterility. And I'm kind of giving the key words in here. These definitions sometimes are very long. This process may be in excess of that necessary to ensure destruction of microorganisms of public health significance, and shall be at least equivalent to the process established by a competent processing authority to achieve commercial sterility. So what we are saying is that the agency would like for you to, submit a filing where you describe the scheduled process, ensuring that there was a processing authority or somebody that is competent in this type of, food or processes that kind of review and analyze the product and provided you with what would be the critical factor or the thing that you're going to follow up, to ensure that this product is manufactured in a safe, wholesome way. Very similar is with the schedule for a process for low acid food. As we mentioned, it has to be established by the qualified individual or person that has knowledge on the thermal processing that is unique required for low acid food. Remember, when we're talking about low acid food, these are very stringent thermal processing methods because we are trying to destroy the spores that are some of the most resistant, phases of bacteria or stages of bacteria that can be in food. So with that, I would like to introduce Niharika and let her tell us a little bit more about acidified foods.
Thank you, Omar. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Omar, Amy, and EAS Consulting Group for inviting Certified Lab to participate in this webinar. Hello, everyone. This is Niharika Mishra, and today I am going to talk about little bit about the acidified food regulations and walk you through the key terms and requirement for this product group as laid out in this overview slide. Next. Let's talk about what is an acidified food. Acidified food is defined as a low acid food to which acids or acid foods are added. Acidified food has a finished equilibrium pH of 4.6 or below and a water activity value of greater than 0.85. Next slide. Since we are talking about the acidified food, it is also important to know what are acid foods. So acid foods are food products that have a natural pH of less or equal to 4.6 without adding anything to this product. So naturally they have a pH of 4.6 or below. Whereas acidified food, as I mentioned in the previous slide, are low acid food to which acid acid foods are added to bring the pH value down to 4.6 or below. In the pH scale, the emphasis is on the pH of 4.6 here, and this is particularly important as it relates to the growth of Clostridium botulinum spores. So this spore can grow and produce toxin in food products with pH greater than 4.6, and low acid food comes in that category, and it can produce toxin under the anaerobic condition. But when the pH is below 4.6, for example, acid and acidified food, this spore cannot germinate and produce toxin as long as the pH of the product remains below 4.6. Next slide. This slide summarizes a few examples of acidified food. As you can see, there are many types of acidified food products that includes vegetables, fruits, puddings, some fish products, etc. Next. Let's look at, in this slide, at the food product that are exempt from the acidified food regulations. So the group of food products that are exempt from acidified food regulations are acid foods that we just discussed, then alcoholic beverages, carbonated beverages, fermented foods, food with water activity value less or equal to 0.85, foods that are stored, distributed, and retail under refrigeration, and jam, jellies, and preserves. So anytime a food product falls on these categories, it is exempt from the acidified food regulation. Next slide. So let's look at how it can be determined whether a food is acidified food or not. This is a little tricky and complex, and a process authority can help in here. So what are the things the process authority can look at? What are the key elements and can figure out whether it's a acidified food or not? So the main thing here is to look at the formulation or the ingredients used to formulate the product, the pH shift of the product after addition of acid or acid foods, the finished equilibrium pH of the product, meaning after the acid is fully diffused throughout the food, especially through the solid particles, and all component of the product reach the same pH value. And after that, any successive measurement should give the same pH result. So that is what the finished equilibrium pH means. The PA also considers the process by which the product is manufactured, including the storage condition. So the key main points are the formulation, the pH shift, the equilibrium pH, and the process and the storage condition, which can help the process authority to determine whether it's acidified food or not. Next slide. Now let's look at what are the key things an acidified food processor need to keep in mind. So the first thing is the product and the process needs to be reviewed by a competent process authority and should have a scheduled process written for that product. The food processing facility should be registered with FDA and should have a food canning establishment number. I think Omar has already mentioned it earlier and showed it in the filing form. And this is done by using the 2541 form. And the next one is the product should be filed with, the acidified food product should be filed with FDA using the 2541E form. So these are the three key things that needs to be kept in the mind. Next slide. Now let's go through some key terms such as scheduled process. So it is the process selected by a processor as adequate for use under the conditions of manufacture for a food in achieving and maintaining a food that will not permit the growth of microorganisms having public health significance. And in case of acidified food, we are looking at a process that renders the food products free of viable microorganisms of public health significance and microorganisms that are capable of reproducing in the food under the normal, non-refrigerated conditions of storage and distribution. So the acidified food must be treated sufficiently to control vegetative pathogens and spoilage microorganisms. The schedule process also defines the critical factors that must be maintained during the processing. And this is also established by the process authority while looking at the formulation and figuring out the schedule process. Next slide. So let's go over what are the critical factors and the record keeping. As discussed in the previous slide, the PA defines the critical factors for the schedule process. So some examples of critical factors can be the finished equilibrium pH of the product, the time and temperature during the thermal treatment, or the product filling temperature, etc. This is the critical factor can be process specific that can be outlined by the PA as the critical factors. So to ensure all the critical factors are met and the product is safe, it is important to keep the records for all the critical factors. It should be measured and recorded at sufficient frequency to ensure the critical factors are met and the hazard is being controlled. Anytime during the food manufacturing process, whenever one or more critical factors as defined in the schedule process are not met, then it leads to the process deviation. Next slide. So what should the food processor do when during the process the critical factors are not met and there is a process deviation? So whenever there is a process deviation, there are three options for the processor. The affected product should be fully reprocessed by a process that is established by a competent PA, or the affected product can be processed as low acid food, or the affected product can be kept separated, and further evaluation should be made to check if the deviation result in a product that may possess any potential public health significance, or if any justification can be made that the food product is still safe with the deviation. So, but this is the, of course, needs to be reviewed by a expert who has the knowledge of the process and the deviation. Next slide. This slide is again showing in the FDA website where you can find the acidified food regulation, that is 21 CFR 114, as shown, highlighted in this slide. Next slide. This slide again shows where you can find the forms, the 2541 forms to register the acidified food manufacturing facility and get an FCE number. This 2541 form, and also the filing form for the acidified food, that is the 2541E form. And this can be done, as Omar mentioned earlier, there can be paper filing and there can be electronic filing. And for the electronic one, you can use the FDA industry system portal. So with that, I will conclude my presentation, and I will hand it over to Omar again.
Thank you so much. I think you can hear me well, right? Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Always double check. Okay, thank you, Niharika. That was great. Let me, before we go in a little bit about, you know, how we're doing a little bit with this, with compliance with these regulations, let me recap a little bit, because what we were trying to do really with this webinar is to show you the basic steps for some of you that may be interested in starting the manufacturing of a new acidified or low acid food, or, you know, trying to, you know, work on new products that may fall into these categories. So we talked about the importance of registration. We talked about the importance of filing, where you disclose the scheduled process. That scheduled process will be determined by a processing authority. For instance, Niharika said PA or process authority. That's okay. Different type of terms referring to that particular person or organization, can be an organization that is, you know, behind the evaluation of this particular formulation and process to determine where it fits, and they come out with the critical factors to show that you have control and you are again manufacturing a wholesome food. Okay, as Niharika mentioned, specifically for acidified food, there is the pH is very important. The pH shift that she mentioned refers to basically how it's moving from what we call the raw pH to the equilibrium pH, that is the pH that, you know, appears several times in the regulations, and you have to demonstrate that you achieved a good pH. Okay, so with that in mind, we went to some of these inspection observations by FDA, and we started looking. This is open to anybody, by the way, it's on the internet. And there are, you know, the observation has been compiling there since the year 2006. There has been some changes in how they are reporting in the last maybe 10 years or something like that. But basically, you can see here to the right, of course, FDA has a jurisdiction that is goes beyond food, right? It covers many other things like drug, device, biologics. And we are starting to focus mainly on the food, because really food, there are a lot of food manufacturing plants in this country. We also import quite a bit, so there are a lot of foreign, facilities, as you can see here in comparison to others. And when you download this Excel file, you can start working with them. Then they are organized in this way, where you see the citation program to the left, the citation ID, and in column number C, you see the reference number. That is where they particularly place the regulation that they're citing for this specific citation, or for each of the citations. Then there are short descriptions and more description, frequency. As you can imagine, these are very, very long files, and there is a lot of information. So we just try to capture the basics related to observations on the 1 CFR 108, the emergency permit. And kind of, I place them in there a little bit in a table from the ones that are the higher numbers to the ones that are the lowers. And you can see that the still process filing is an observation that they find. In 2000, they had 44 observations. In 2019, they had 44 observations. We haven't been making much of a change. If there was change, in many others, it was going. The recall, remember, the regulation include the requirement of a recall by the manufacturing facility. So we have like 23 in 2006, and we still have like 11 in the last few years, and so forth. Registration is still continuing to be a little bit of an issue. This is a little bit the reason why we organize the webinar, to provide you a little bit more information about registration and process filing, because we see that it's still an important observation by federal inspectors. Okay. You can see this a little bit in graph, where I put in here the ones that are the most important in numbers: process, filing, recall procedures, registration. Most of you will see that and will all probably try to ask me, what happened in the year 2010 and 2011? We don't know yet. It may be just a reporting issue, or the way they were, doing these inspections. This one has the observation by type, also with a lower number of observations that we have. One thing to remember is, in here you can see approved schools. It has been going up a little bit higher, and refers to a specific requirements in which all plant personnel involved in acidification, pH control, heat treatment, shall be under the operating supervision of a person who has attended at a school approved by the commissioner, for giving instruction in food handling techniques, food protection principles, personal hygiene, plant sanitation practices, pH control, and critical factor. So it's very important to remember that there may be a lot of people doing training, but there are some specific groups that are really driven by a large association. Now would be the Consumers Brand, but it was GMA, who has been in charge of putting together this canned foods, a book. The Science and Education Foundation branch from them is the one organizing that. This is this 8th edition, and my understanding is that there is a 9th edition that was supposed to be coming out this year. I don't know if that will happen, but that will be updated, and most probably by next year it's gonna be out. And this is the type of training that we do, following a little bit this kind of manual. With that, I think we are ready to start moving into some of the questions submitted during the registration, right, Amy?
Yes, that's correct.
I guess some of these questions are going to be for you, Niharika, right?
Yes. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, let's look at some questions, and Omar, feel free to like add in wherever you feel like. Um, so the first question is, how do I determine if a product is an acidified food or not? So I think this is one of the slide I have during the presentation. So this should be done by a process authority, keeping in mind the product, formulation, the pH, the equilibrium pH, the entire processing, the storage condition, etc. So I think this should be evaluated by NPA by looking at all those factors. The second question is the 5-log kill step for acidified food a requirement or a guideline? What are the other options and what info would FDA need? Technically, there is no log reduction requirement in the regulation. I think FDA would accept a lower log reduction if proper or enough justification is provided. This is again go back to the product formulation, the processing, and this should be again evaluated by a person having adequate knowledge in this field. What are the other options, it says? So I think probably this is related to processing. So you can have a process where you can just control the pH, or you can have a thermal process with preservative. You can have pH with the preservative. So there are different kind of, I think there are various options to control that. But again, that would be product and process specific. Is 5-log a rule? Is there an increase in non-traditional products being classified as acidified? Example, beverages and condiments. As I mentioned, I think this 5-log rule, it kinds of borrowed from the juice HACCP regulation, I would say, because there were many outbreaks in the juice industry, which are like acidic product. And there were a lot of outbreaks related to, I think, apple and orange juices. And the 5-log reduction was kind of mandating for the juice HACCP. But this kind of carried over to the acidified food or vegetables products. So this is again not required for the acidified food, but again you need to justify why it is not. In terms of the beverages, I think again that would depend upon many factors. For example, if it's a refrigerated beverage, then definitely it is exempt from the acidified food regulation. So it is again depend on the various factors that I outlined earlier. For the condiments product, it can go under acid or acidified food, depend upon the how the ingredients are and how it shifts the pH of the product and where the equilibrium pH lands at after we have the finished product. So it is again needs to be evaluated. So what are the key acidified food safety hazard that needs to be controlled? So acidified food must be treated sufficiently to control the spoilage microorganism along with the vegetative pathogens. As long as the pH, the finished equilibrium pH of the product remains below like 4.6, we can rule out the risk of Clostridium botulinum. However, if the growth of spoilage microorganism is not controlled properly, the action of the spoilage microorganism can reach the pH of the product, and it can compromise the safety of the product and the Clostridium botulinum can grow. So yes, care needs to be taken for vegetative pathogen and the spoilage microorganisms both. The next question is, when reviewing formulas as to whether acid is inherent for a flavor or actually added for food safety, how does that math work? So here, I would say the bottom line is, anytime an acid is added to the product to bring the pH of the final product below 4.6, I think that's where it will call is as acidified food. So if we are adding the acid for the flavor, we can still ask the question, is it helping you to bring the pH also down to 4.6 or not? So I think that's way we can determine that. Next slide. So the next question is whether vegan cream cheese is the acidified food or low acid food. Okay, just by looking at the name, it is kind of hard to determine whether acidified or low acid. I think the main thing is to look at the pH. But again, we have to look through all those other factors that I outlined or mentioned during the presentation we need to look at. But figuring out whether acidified or low acid, I think is the pH, whether below 4.6 or above 4.6. How do we determine if an acidified food can be canned by looking at the recipe? I think here the question is about packaging of the product. I don't think it is not necessarily have to be canned. I think it can be packaged in jar, bottles, glass container, pouches. For example, I think olives can be packed in can, or olives can be packed in glass container. So I think it is again the product and process specific. What kind of time, temperature are being used, whether your packaging material can withstand that temperature or not. I think those kind of questions need to be reviewed in here. The next question is, how do you classify a food as acidified food? Does salad dressing come under acidified food? If not, why? I think this is again go back to my presentations, one of the slide where I talk about how do we determine. So that would be again determined by a process authority looking at all those factors, the pH, the ingredients, the process, the storage condition, etc. Does salad dressing comes under acidified foods? I think it can be again acid or acidified food that needs to be again determined looking at all those parameters that are described earlier.
Niharika, if you don't mind, we're gonna go a little bit more with other questions because it's almost 45 minutes.
Sure.
Are you okay?
Yeah.
So as you can see, we got so many questions and they are becoming to be very similar in some cases. We got some regulatory questions that I just wanted to cover up a little bit quickly because I still find sometimes this concept of an acidified ingredient, like people saying, it's an ingredient called acidified. The ingredients are really called low acid ingredients or acid ingredients. A food can be a low acid food, an acidified food or acid. So really the acidified food is what Niharika was describing, that is when you bring a low acid food ingredient to below 4.6 by mixing it with acid ingredients or acids, okay? One about low acid canned food and FSMA, we have covered that a little bit, but it's important to remember that FSMA does not provide exemption for acidified food regulations under 21 CFR 14. The exemption is more for subpart C and G within CFR 21 CFR 117, and is for really those that are covered under 113, that is thermally processed low acid food packed in hermetically sealed containers, okay? The exemption in paragraph D is applicable only with respect to the microbiological hazards. What would be typical process for preventive control for production of an acidified food? That's a very generic one. And you know, it all depends, and you will start with whatever food safety system that you have. If you have already a hazard plan, you will start converting it into a, you know, preventive control. And remember, many plants are already going into certifications, food safety certifications. So, you know, that can also help you organize how you go into the production of acidified food. And again, we are emphasizing the importance of registration, filing, and having a processing authority that reviews what you do. We have some presentation that, I mean, writing that we did before on how to, you know, recognize these modernized GMPs and how to add it to food safety plans. Regulations, another one related to regulation is, what can I advise my customers who are new to importing low acid canned food and acidified food? Well, it's important again that they understand that that foreign facility will have to comply with regulations similar to a domestic facility. Therefore, there's going to be this FDA food manufacturing facility registration that they will have to go through. Register under the acidified low acid canned food in the FDA industry systems, and start completing and submitting 2141 form for each of the products. So I think I'm gonna move towards the end of the question. We're gonna bypass a little bit the rest, Amy, so we can give a little bit of room before the end of the hour to some of the participants that submitting some questions. Okay?
Sure, that's fine.
So would you like to read some of the ones that we received, if you don't mind?
Yes, absolutely. We've got a number of questions, and of course everyone can submit theirs by typing them into the Q&A button in your toolbar. The first question I thought was interesting, and it's, how does the process authority witness the process? Is it done remotely? Is it by pure calculation?
I can jump and say a little bit about that. It depends on how much you are interacting with this company. In my particular case, these are, you know, there is no really one rule that fits all, but sometimes when I start working with new companies, I prefer visiting the place, understanding that. Now that we cannot do that, you know, people working in those facilities are our, I said, our eyes and ears. So we need to make sure that we build a trust, because they have to disclose a lot of information with you in order for you to do a full assessment. So, you know, there is many different tools that we use. There is no single way of doing it. It's, again, how you start building that report and that trust with the company that you're working with. I don't know if you want to add something, Niharika, to that.
Yeah, I mean, here at Certified, we have some questionnaires to begin the process. So that gives us some idea about the product and process. But of course, I think we have also NDA in place before they disclose all that information. And I think after reviewing that, we try to advise whether we need any more additional information or whatever is provided that is sufficient to, you know, write the letter.
Right, right.
And anyone who has questions on assistance with that, you've got Alan Saylor, who's the Senior Director for Food Consulting Services on the screen. I've just got a note here. And it's A. Saylor at EAS Consulting Group. Thank you, Diane. Appreciate that. I misspelled group, but if you correct the spelling, that is the correct spelling of Alan's.
It's just one G, right?
Just one. Well, I've got the, no, it's the G's correct. It's Group. So there's two G's.
Oh, right.
Thank you. And then, yes, a number of people have asked if we're sending the slides out. We are sending them at the conclusion of the presentation. And we'll, of course, send it with the correct email address. The next question is regarding a pH shift. And the question is the pH shift mentioned in CFR 114?
I don't think there is mention of that. It's what we use to evaluate how we drop a low acid food into the category of an acidified food. The pH shift is an important component, but we also evaluate if there is any kind of buffering capacity in that particular food that can start bringing up the pH up, as Niharika mentioned, especially with those formulations that have a pH very close to a 4.6. Okay, we always try to have some extra room to work with. So the pH shift is important. The equilibrium pH is the most important one. The actual equilibrium pH sometimes varies. When is the actual time? It depends on the formulation. You have to calculate that.
Yeah, sometimes I think it can take like a few minutes to, I think days, I guess, depend upon the buffering capacity.
Right. The less buffering capacity you have, the more those acid food or acids will drop the pH and stay there wherever they equilibrate, right?
And whenever it takes longer time, I think it is advisable to refrigerate the product.
Okay.
All right, thank you for that. The next question, if we adjust the acid amount in an acidified beverage, will this be considered a significant formulation change, and will it need a new process authority letter?
It's a beverage, they said?
Yeah, I'm not getting the question.
Yeah, if it is a beverage, by definition, you are exempt from acidified food.
Okay.
So maybe it's not a very clear question. Yeah.
Okay.
Let's go to the next one.
Okay, if Luana's out there, if you want to just rephrase your question, we can try again. Let's see. Do you have any insight as to whether FDA will reissue industry guidance for processing acidified foods?
Niharika, do you want to go first?
Sorry, what's the question again?
Do you have any insight as to whether FDA will reissue the industry guidance to processing acidified foods?
I think the last thing I knew was it was like a guidance document was released in 2010. But I think that was, I think retrieved a few years back. But to my knowledge right now, I don't think there is anything out there.
Okay.
That's right. That's right. There is nothing we are not aware. Maybe they're trying to do something that we're not aware of. But in the previous webinar, we also dealt with that guidance, and we this back in 2018, we also mentioned that we were not aware of any new guidance coming down.
So it was the 2010 that was last released, right, Omar? And
right,
then
right.
Was it retrieved?
That's right. Went through a comment period, and I guess it's stalled at that point. It never moved forward from that. Yeah.
Yeah.
From a draft of guidance.
And we have just a few minutes left. There's a question sent in regarding how EAS and Certified can help facilities, startup facilities and customers. And Omar, working directly with clients, would you like to give an overview, and then we can let Niharika as well discuss how Certified would be able to assist?
Yeah, the basics, you know, that's more of a question to address later. They can reach Alan, they can reach you, Amy or Niharika, and then you guys can start a little bit that conversation. As an independent consultant, I'm brought in sometimes when you guys need somebody to do some assessments for many different reasons. And that's how I have been working with you guys for several years already, right, Amy?
Yes, I believe so. Certainly a number of years.
Yeah.
So Diane, if you'd like, I'll be glad to ask Alan to reach out to you directly and just discuss some of the services we can provide. We've got one more question. I'll have this one be the last one. And it is, would a home kitchen operation of a acidified food or LACF for a primarily wholesale function require registration?
If they're doing interstate trade, yes. I doubt a very small kitchen will have the capability to have a retort or an aseptic system, but they can do acidified food.
Okay, great.
If they are actually doing just intrastate sale, not selling outside the state, they have to go through the state regulations. Those vary according to the state.
Okay. Great, thank you. And included in our wrap-up email that we'll be sending in the next couple days, I'll include a link to the 2018 webinar as well. I saw a question that was submitted today regarding tomatoes. I believe we covered tomatoes in the earlier webinar. So some of the questions submitted, you'll be able to find the answers there. So thanks everyone very much for joining us. I'll just mention we have a few additional webinars coming up if you're interested. August 6th, we have a webinar on temporary modifications for food labeling during COVID-19. On September 20th, there is a webinar that is co-presented by EAS and certified again, and it's on food hygiene best practices. We have a new one we're in the process of scheduling on Prop 65 that will be coming up September 24th. And we also have a short course on equipment sanitation that will start on August 24th. It will run August 24th, 26th, and 27th. So all of that information will be available on our website as well. So thanks everyone so much for joining us. Thank you both Omar and Niharika for your presentation. We did record this, so we'll get it processed and up on the EAS website in a few days. And thanks everyone again.
Thank you, Amy. And before we depart, I just want to mention for the certified side that we do have a lot of, service available, and anyone interested can reach out to us. You can give my email and then I can forward it to the respective persons so that they can know. But in nutshell, I think we do a lot of validation study, self-life study, the peer review, and a lot of product testing.
Perfect. Thanks for that. And we'll include Niharika's information in our wrap-up email as well. So thanks everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.